Lawrence said 5 words that saved Chris Thompson's life. "Sir, please don't get in yet." This immediately created confusion. Drivers don't refuse their employers. Tension. Something was dangerously wrong. Trust demanded, in a man Chris barely knew. A choice between arrogance and survival. The moment promised. A hidden threat. A life or death decision. A relationship transformed by truth. A lesson about seeing the people you've trained yourself to ignore. It hooked Chris through an impossible contradiction. The obedient driver, who suddenly broke every rule. And that disobedience, those 5 seconds of hesitation before Chris trusted him, would be the only reason Chris Thompson lived to see sunrise. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Also, let me tell you something funny. Someone actually bet that I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year, and honestly, I want to prove them wrong. So if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and join the family. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is a very personal goal for me, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you for believing in me and being part of this journey. And before you go, drop your name and location in the comments. I'd love to give you a special shout out in my next video. Introduction. The air was knife cold. The kind of December morning that turns breath into fog and makes even billionaires move quickly from heated buildings to heated cars. Chris Thompson stood outside his penthouse on East 72nd Street, checking his phone with the mechanical efficiency of a man who measured his life in increments of productivity. 42 years old. Self-made. Tech and defense contracting empire worth $3.4 billion. 3 failed marriages. No children. A circle so small it could fit in an elevator. Regina, his executive assistant who anticipated his needs before he voiced them. Kayla, his head of corporate communications who made problems disappear before they reached headlines. Thomas, his private security chief who treated threats like mathematical equations to be solved. And now Lawrence. The black Range Rover pulled up with its usual precision, not a second early, never a moment late. The engine's low purr was the only sound on the empty street. Chris had stopped learning his drivers' names after the 7th one. They were functions, not people. Tools that either worked or were replaced. Lawrence had lasted 3 weeks. That was already longer than most. Chris knew exactly 3 things about him. He was black. He was quiet. He drove like someone who understood that a billionaire's time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute. That morning, Chris knew nothing else. He should have known more. Chris reached for the door handle, his mind already in the 7 a.m. meeting, the 9 a.m. conference call, the hostile board member who needed to be managed before the afternoon vote. Then Lawrence spoke. "Sir, please don't get in yet." Chris's hand froze on the chrome handle. The street was silent except for the idling engine. Somewhere a garbage truck groaned through its route. The doorman behind him shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene. Chris turned slowly, the way a king might turn to acknowledge a peasant who just contradicted him in court. "Excuse me?" Lawrence sat perfectly still behind the wheel, both hands visible at 10 and 2. His eyes weren't on Chris. They were focused forward, scanning the intersection ahead with an intensity that felt wrong for a Tuesday morning commute. "There's a delivery truck," Lawrence said, his voice low and even, parked across the intersection. Corner of Park and 73rd. Chris frowned. "And? It wasn't there yesterday. Or any day before that. And it's idling wrong." Idling wrong. Chris heard the edge in his own voice, the tone that made subordinates backpedal and hedge fund managers reconsider their positions. Lawrence didn't backpedal. The engine sound is off. Too heavy for an empty truck. And the driver hasn't gotten out. He's been sitting there since I arrived 5 minutes ago. Chris felt the irritation building, that familiar heat that came from having his time wasted by someone whose job was to not waste his time. "So what exactly are you suggesting?" "A different route." Lawrence's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting Chris's gaze for the first time. Now. The word hung between them. Chris had built his fortune on reading people, on knowing when someone was lying, when they were bluffing, when they were desperate or dangerous or useful. He'd sat across from Russian oligarchs and Chinese tech executives and Pentagon generals, and he always knew. But looking at Lawrence's face in that mirror, calm, focused, absolutely certain, Chris couldn't read him at all. What he could read was the complete absence of fear in a man who was about to be fired. "You're suggesting I'm in danger," Chris said slowly. "I'm suggesting we don't find out." The hesitation lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds where Chris weighed his skepticism against something he couldn't name, some instinct, some buried survival sense that recognized danger even when logic couldn't explain it. 4 seconds that separated life from death. "Fine," Chris said tightly. "Different route. But I'm late for." "I know," Lawrence interrupted. "I'll make up the time." He didn't wait for permission. The Range Rover moved smoothly away from the curb, turning right instead of left, taking them away from Chris's usual route down Park Avenue. Chris settled into the leather seat, already pulling up his calendar, ready to forget this bizarre exchange. But he noticed Lawrence's hands on the wheel. They were perfectly steady. They were in Lexington, heading south through lighter traffic, when Chris's phone exploded. Not literally, though for a moment, when he saw 16 missed calls, 3 from Regina, 4 from Thomas, and 9 from unknown numbers, his mind went blank with the kind of primitive fear that wealth can't insulate against. He answered Regina's call. "Chris." She was screaming. Regina never screamed. "Are you? Where are you? Tell me you're not." "I'm in the car, what?" There was an explosion. Her voice cracked. "You're out. Park and 73rd. A car." "Chris, it was a black Range Rover." "They're saying it was." She couldn't finish. Chris felt the blood drain from his face, felt the phone slip in his suddenly numb fingers. "When?" he whispered. 6 minutes ago. Right at 5:52. "Your exact time." "Chris, they're saying it was targeted. They're saying it was you." The phone fell silent except for Regina's ragged breathing. Chris slowly, mechanically, raised his eyes to the rearview mirror. Lawrence was watching him. Their eyes met in the reflection, and Chris saw something he hadn't noticed before, not in 3 weeks of daily drives, not in all the background checks Thomas had run, not in the professional distance Lawrence had maintained like a wall. Lawrence had known. Not suspected. Not guessed. No. "How far are we from the office?" Chris heard himself ask, his voice strange and distant. "For minutes," Lawrence replied calmly. "We'll take the underground entrance. Service elevator to your private floor. I've already notified Thomas." "You've already?" Chris stopped. "When did you notify Thomas?" "Before I picked you up this morning." The words settled over the car like a shroud. Chris's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to stop the tremor, trying to think through the roaring in his ears. Someone had tried to kill him. Someone had planted a bomb, or sent a car bomb, or whatever the hell had just happened on Park Avenue, where his car should have been, where he should have been. And the only reason he wasn't ash and shattered glass was the man driving him. The man he'd almost fired 30 seconds ago for wasting his time. "Lawrence," Chris said quietly. "Yes, sir." "How did you know?" Lawrence was silent for a long moment. The Range Rover glided smoothly through an intersection, taking them deeper into Midtown, away from the chaos erupting behind them. "I didn't know," Lawrence finally said. "I suspected enough to act." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give you right now." They pulled into the underground garage beneath Thompson Tower. Security was already swarming. Thomas's people, building security, 2 NYPD units that must have been called the moment the explosion registered. Thomas himself was there, striding toward the Range Rover before it fully stopped, his face a mask of controlled fury and relief. But Chris didn't move. He sat in the back seat, staring at Lawrence's reflection. "Who are you?" Chris asked. Lawrence turned slightly, enough that Chris could see his profile, strong jaw, close-cropped hair, a small scar near his left temple that Chris had never noticed before. "Someone who pays attention," Lawrence said simply. Then Thomas was pulling Chris's door open, barking orders, demanding answers, sweeping Chris toward the elevator with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd prepared for this scenario 100 times in theory. Chris let himself be moved, but he kept his eyes on Lawrence. The driver stepped out of the vehicle, standing at attention as Thomas's security team swarmed him, their hands already moving toward weapons, their voices sharp with suspicion and adrenaline. And Lawrence, the quietest man Chris had ever employed, the one he'd barely noticed for 3 weeks, met the storm with absolute calm. Because he'd been expecting it. He'd been expecting all of it. The last thing Chris saw before the elevator doors closed was Lawrence's face, composed and unreadable, as Thomas's second-in-command began the interrogation that would tear apart everything Chris thought he knew. The man Chris barely noticed had saved his life. But the question now wasn't just, how did he know? It was, what else does he know? And more terrifying, is it over? The secure room on the 47th floor had no windows. Chris Thompson had designed it that way, soundproofed walls, encrypted air-gap systems, a space where secrets could be contained and extracted with surgical precision. He'd never imagined he'd be sitting here learning that his life had been saved by a man he couldn't read. Thomas paced like a caged predator, his usually immaculate suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Not rage at the threat. Thomas had spent 20 years in executive protection. Threats were his currency. Rage at being blindsided. Explain it again, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. From the beginning. Lawrence sat in the center chair, hands resting calmly on the metal table. No fidgeting. No defensive posture. He'd been here for 40 minutes and hadn't shifted position once. Chris watched from the corner, a position he never occupied. In his world, he held court from the head of the table, commanded rooms from elevated positions, dominated through presence and power. But right now, he needed to observe. Regina stood beside him, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. She'd arrived within 10 minutes of Chris reaching the building, her usually perfect makeup smudged, her eyes red. She hadn't cried, Regina didn't cry, but she'd come close. Kayla was on the phone in the adjacent room, her voice a controlled murmur as she managed the media firestorm. Industrial accident, ongoing investigation. Mr. Thompson is safe and cooperating with authorities. The lies came easily to her. They always did. Lawrence spoke. 3 months ago, I was working nights at Ramirez Auto in Brooklyn. Transmission rebuilds mostly. Good money, quiet work. Why nights? Thomas interrupted. You had a day job. Security guard. Warehouse in Red Hook. Needed the extra income. For what? Sister's medical bills. Lupus. Medication costs $12,000 a month even with insurance. Chris felt something shift in his chest. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Everyone had leverage points. Everyone had weaknesses that could be exploited. He'd built an empire understanding that. But Lawrence wasn't asking for anything. He was just stating facts. Continue, Thomas said. Lawrence's eyes remained forward, focused on a point just past Thomas's shoulder. 2 men came in late one night. Around 2 a.m. needed work on a van. Cash job, no paperwork. I took it. Describe them. One white, early 40s, expensive watch but cheap jacket. Trying to look working class but failing. The other was Eastern European, maybe Russian. Accent. Tattoos on his knuckles, prison ink. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You noticed all that while working on their van? I notice everything, Lawrence said simply. It's how I stayed alive for 8 years in Helmand province. The room went quiet. Chris straightened slightly. Thomas's file had mentioned military service, but the details had been sparse. Honorable discharge and commendations were all Chris had registered before signing off on the hire. He should have read deeper. They thought I was wearing headphones, Lawrence continued. I wasn't. I was listening. Lawrence's voice remained even, but Chris heard something underneath it now, not emotion exactly, but intensity. Memory carved into words. The Russian said a name. Christopher Thompson. Tech defense contractor. Upper East Side. He said it 3 times, like he was confirming. The other man, the one in the cheap jacket? pulled out a phone and showed him something. Photos looked like a black Range Rover, route maps, timing schedules. Chris felt his stomach turn cold. They talked about a board meeting, Lawrence said. Midtown. High profile. They said it needed to look clean. An accident. Vehicle malfunction. Lithium battery fire or maybe a gas tank rupture. And you kept working on their van, Thomas said, disbelief sharp in his tone. I kept working. Lawrence's hands flexed once, the only sign of tension. Because if I'd run, if I'd reacted, they would have known I heard. And I needed to hear everything. What else did they say? Chris asked, speaking for the first time. Lawrence turned his head slightly, acknowledging him. They talked about payment. $500,000. They talked about a contact inside your organization. Someone feeding information. Routes. Schedules. Security gaps. The room exploded. Bullshit, Thomas snarled, slamming his hand on the table. My team is vetted. Every single person goes through. I'm telling you what I heard, Lawrence interrupted calmly. Whether you believe it is your choice. Regina's hand found Chris's arm, her fingers cold. Chris, if there's someone inside. We'll find them, Chris said, his voice harder than steel. Continue, Lawrence. That's everything relevant. They paid cash, picked up the van the next morning. I never saw them again. So you went to the police, Thomas said, but it wasn't a question. It was a test. I went to the FBI field office in Federal Plaza. Anonymous tip. Gave them everything. The name, the threat, descriptions of both men, even the van's partial plate number I'd memorized. And? Lawrence's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They thanked me for my civic duty. Said they'd look into it. Took my contact number, a burner I bought specifically for this. Never called. They didn't believe you, Chris said quietly. Or they couldn't verify it in time. Or the tip got buried in bureaucracy. Or, Lawrence stopped himself. It doesn't matter why. What mattered was that nothing happened. No increased security. No investigation I could see. And I kept watching the news, kept checking. For what? Regina asked softly. For Christopher Thompson's obituary. The bluntness of it silenced the room. Chris studied Lawrence's face, the steady gaze, the absolute lack of performance. This wasn't a man seeking attention or reward. This was a man stating facts with the same flat effect he'd used to report a vehicle's oil level. So you did what exactly? Thomas demanded. The only thing left. I got close. Lawrence leaned forward slightly, the first real movement he'd made since the interrogation began. I applied for your driver position. Used my real name, real records, real background. I knew the vetting would be intense, so I gave them everything. My Marine service. My discharge. The incident in Kandahar. The incident, Thomas repeated slowly, where you disobeyed a direct order and got your commanding officer killed. Where I saved 14 civilians, Lawrence corrected, his voice still even, including 6 children, during an ambush that killed Captain Rodriguez because he ordered us to abandon them. Yes. Chris felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the careful walls he'd built between himself and everyone else. You lost your career, Chris said. I kept my conscience. Not the same thing. No, sir. It's not. Thomas was shaking his head. You infiltrated a position to protect someone you'd never met based on a conversation you overheard once. Do you understand how insane that sounds? I understand how it sounds, Lawrence said. I also understand that I was right. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. You didn't know the exact timing, Chris said slowly, pieces falling into place. This morning, the delivery truck, you were guessing. I was calculating, Lawrence corrected. I knew the board meeting was scheduled for today. I knew the threat mentioned your usual morning route. I knew that if someone wanted it to look accidental, they'd hit you in transit, not at home or office where security is tightest. So you watched, Regina breathed. Every morning for 3 weeks. I arrived early, studied the route, looked for anomalies. And this morning I saw one. Thomas moved closer, his shadow falling across Lawrence. You put yourself between a billionaire and an assassination attempt. But what's your angle? What do you want? Lawrence looked up at him, and for the first time, Chris saw something flicker across his face. Not anger. Not fear. Exhaustion. I don't want anything, Lawrence said quietly. I just couldn't let another person die when I could have prevented it. Another person, Chris repeated. You mean Captain Rodriguez? I mean everyone I couldn't save. In Kandahar. In Mosul. In places that don't have names anymore. Lawrence's hands finally moved, clasping together. I spent 8 years being trained to protect people. Then I was punished for doing exactly that. So I came home and worked security jobs and rebuilt transmissions and told myself it was enough. But it wasn't, Regina said softly. No, it wasn't. Chris moved forward, pulling out the chair across from Lawrence and sitting for the first time. Eye level. Equal footing. You deliberately put yourself in danger, Chris said. Applied for a job that would place you directly in the kill zone. No backup. No guarantee anyone would believe you even if you'd succeeded. Yes, sir. Why? Lawrence met his eyes directly. Because I've seen what happens when good people wait for someone else to act. They wait, and people die, and everyone says, if only we'd known. But someone always knows. Someone always sees the signs. They just don't believe it's their responsibility. And you do, Chris said. I did what Captain Rodriguez would have wanted me to do. What he died trying to do. Lawrence's voice cracked just slightly. I saved people. Even when it cost me everything. The silence stretched. Thomas stood rigid, his face unreadable. Regina had tears streaming down her cheeks now, her tablet forgotten. And Chris, ruthless, emotionally detached Chris Thompson who trusted systems over people, who measured human value in productivity and efficiency, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. You saved my life, Chris said simply. I delayed your route long enough for the timing to fail, Lawrence corrected. The threat is still active. The people who planned this are still out there. And your insider, whoever fed them your information, is still inside your organization. Thomas's face went pale. Then this isn't over. No, Lawrence said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. It's not. Chris stood slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities, threats, countermeasures. But underneath the tactical thinking, underneath the survival instinct, one truth burned clear. The man sitting in this interrogation room had saved his life not for money, not for recognition, not for advancement, but because it was right. And Chris Thompson, who'd spent 20 years believing that morality was for people who couldn't afford pragmatism, had just been saved by someone who'd sacrificed everything for a principle. Thomas, Chris said quietly. Let him go. Chris. Let him go. Chris turned to Lawrence. But stay in the building. If they're still out there, if this isn't finished. I'll be here, Lawrence said, standing. That's why I came. He moved toward the door, but Chris stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, Chris said. 2 words he rarely spoke. Lawrence nodded once, then left. The door closed behind him, and Chris sank back against the table, suddenly exhausted. He's either a hero or the greatest manipulator I've ever seen, Thomas muttered. He's both, Regina said quietly. Or neither. But he's the reason Chris is alive. Chris looked at the door where Lawrence had disappeared. Someone wanted him dead. Someone inside his organization had betrayed him. And the only person standing between him and a second attempt was a driver he'd barely noticed for 3 weeks. A driver who'd been watching everything. 48 hours after the explosion, Chris Thompson's world had transformed into a fortress. Thomas had tripled the security detail. 8 rotating teams, ex-Secret Service and former Special Forces, each member vetted through channels so deep they bordered on paranoid. The penthouse had new biometric locks. The office had armed guards on every floor. Even Regina and Kayla now traveled with protection. The board meeting had been moved to a secure location. The FBI had finally opened an investigation, too late to prevent the first attack, but at least they were asking questions now. And forensics had confirmed what Lawrence said. The explosion was sophisticated, professional, designed to look like a vehicle malfunction. Someone had wanted Chris Thompson dead badly enough to invest serious money and expertise. But 2 days had passed. No second attempt. No new threats. Thomas called it lying low. Chris called it opportunity. Absolutely not, Thomas said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. They were in Chris's office, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind them through bulletproof glass. You are not attending the Children's Hospital Gala. I'm the keynote speaker, Chris replied, not looking up from his tablet. And the largest donor. My absence would generate exactly the kind of speculation we're trying to avoid. Your death would generate more. Then don't let me die. Chris finally looked up. That's what I pay you for. Regina stood by the window, her arms crossed. Chris, Thomas is right. The media attention alone is exactly why I need to go. Chris set down the tablet. Kayla's been managing the narrative, but rumors are spreading. If I hide, if I show fear, the board smells blood. Parker and Mitchell are already circling, questioning my leadership. I can't afford to look weak. You can't afford to be dead, Thomas shot back. Which is why you'll have every security measure in place. Chris's voice hardened. This isn't a request, Thomas. I'm going to that gala. The only question is whether you're coming with me or whether I need to find someone who will. The threat hung in the air. Thomas's jaw worked silently. Finally, if you go, Lawrence drives. Chris blinked. Lawrence? He's not trained for. He's the only person in this building who's proven he can spot a threat before my entire security apparatus. Thomas leaned forward. He drives. Non-negotiable. And I'm in the vehicle with you. Chris considered. Lawrence had been kept in the building, given a room on the executive floor, interviewed 16 more times by Thomas's team. Each session produced the same result. His story never wavered, no inconsistencies, no hidden agenda anyone could find. Either he was telling the truth, or he was the most sophisticated operative Chris had ever encountered. Fine, Chris said. Lawrence drives. Saturday evening. The Children's Hospital benefit at the Plaza Hotel. Manhattan's elite gathering to demonstrate their philanthropy and be photographed doing it. Chris emerged from the building at 7:15 p.m., dressed in a Tom Ford tuxedo, Regina at his side in an emerald gown that cost more than most people's cars. Kayla had gone ahead to manage press access. The Range Rover waited, engine running, surrounded by 3 escort vehicles. Lawrence stood beside the driver's door. Chris stopped. In the 48 hours since the interrogation, he'd barely seen Lawrence. But now, in the glow of the building's entrance lights, Chris noticed details he'd missed before. The way Lawrence's eyes never stopped moving, scanning rooftops, checking sight lines, noting every person on the street. The slight tension in his shoulders. The positioning of his body to shield the vehicle's door. Military training. Always on. Never off. Evening, sir, Lawrence said quietly. Lawrence. Chris moved toward the vehicle, then paused. Thank you for agreeing to this. Something flickered across Lawrence's face. Surprise, maybe, that Chris had thanked him. It's my job, sir. No, Chris said. Your job is to drive. This is something else. Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them. Acknowledgement of the unspoken truth that Lawrence had chosen this, was continuing to choose it, even knowing the danger. Thomas emerged from the building, his bulk somehow elegant in a tailored suit that concealed God knew what weapons. Let's move. The longer we stand here, the better target we make. Chris climbed into the back with Thomas. Regina took the front passenger seat, her phone already out, coordinating with Kayla. Lawrence slid behind the wheel, and the convoy moved out. The drive should have taken 12 minutes. It took 8. 8 minutes that would replay in Chris's mind for the rest of his life. They were on Park Avenue, 3 blocks from the plaza, when Lawrence's voice cut through the comfortable silence. Sir. Not Mr. Thompson. Not we're almost there. Just, sir. Chris looked up from his phone. Lawrence's eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, his hands tightening on the wheel. What is it? Thomas asked, instantly alert. Silver sedan. 3 cars back. Headlights flashing. Too short, one long, two short. Chris felt his stomach drop. That's the signal from the garage. Lawrence's voice was absolutely calm, but Chris heard the steel underneath. The one they used to coordinate. Thomas was already moving, twisting to look behind them, his hand going to his jacket. I don't see. Not the sedan, Lawrence said. The motorcycle. 2 o'clock. Been pacing us since we left. Chris saw it, a black motorcycle, rider in dark leathers, keeping perfect distance. Could be coincidence, Regina whispered, but her voice shook. No coincidence. Lawrence accelerated smoothly, changing lanes. Thomas, call the escort vehicles. Tell them possible hostile contact. Thomas was already on his radio, his voice clipped and professional. The motorcycle matched their speed. The sedan dropped back. And then Chris saw the van. It came from a side street, moving too fast, cutting across traffic to pull parallel with them. The side door was already sliding open. Time seemed to slow. Chris saw Lawrence's eyes in the mirror, focused, calculating, already 3 moves ahead. He saw Thomas reaching for a weapon that wouldn't draw fast enough. He saw Regina turning, her mouth opening in a scream that hadn't yet found sound. And he heard Lawrence's voice, cutting through it all with absolute authority. Sir, unbuckle. Now. Chris's hands moved before his brain processed the command. The seatbelt clicked free. Lawrence slammed the accelerator. The Range Rover's engine roared. 600 horsepower launched them forward like a bullet, throwing Chris back against the seat. The escort vehicles struggled to keep pace. The van tried to match them. But the motorcycle didn't. Lawrence swerved into oncoming traffic, horns blaring, headlights blazing in Chris's face. Regina screamed. Thomas was shouting coordinates into his radio. And Lawrence drove. Not recklessly. Not wildly. With precision. Every turn calculated. Every acceleration timed. Reading the traffic like a tactical situation, finding gaps that shouldn't exist, threading the Range Rover through spaces that seemed impossibly small. They're still with us. Thomas yelled. The rear window exploded. Glass showered the interior. Chris felt something hot whistle past his ear. Too close, Jesus Christ, too close. Down. Lawrence barked. Chris dropped, pulling Regina down with him. Thomas returned fire, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. More bullets. The distinctive crack of high-powered rounds hitting armor. The Range Rover was rated for small arms fire. Chris knew that. Thomas had shown him the specs, but hearing it and living it were 2 completely different things. Lawrence wrenched the wheel right. They mounted a curb, scattering pedestrians, crashed through a construction barrier, and suddenly they were in a narrow service alley. Too narrow. The side mirrors scraped brick walls on both sides, the sound like metal screaming. Lawrence didn't slow down. Behind them, the motorcycle tried to follow. Couldn't make the turn. Chris heard the crash, the rider's body hitting the pavement. But the gunfire didn't stop. Second shooter. Thomas roared. On foot ahead of us. Chris raised his head just enough to see. A figure at the end of the alley, silhouetted against the street lights, raising something. Lawrence didn't brake. He accelerated. The Range Rover erupted from the alley doing 60, directly at the shooter. The man dove aside, his weapon clattering away. They were on Broadway now, traffic thick, nowhere to go. Lawrence went anyway. Up on the sidewalk. Between buildings. Through a taxi stand. The Range Rover taking damage, pieces flying off, but still moving, still protecting them. Almost there. Lawrence called out. Security checkpoint 3 blocks. Chris saw it, the NYPD mobile command post set up for the gala, barriers and armed officers, and the shot came from above. Rooftop, Chris's mind registered. Sniper. Professional setup. The bullet punched through the windshield right where Lawrence's head had been a second before. But Lawrence had already moved, had somehow seen it coming, was already swerving. The second bullet didn't miss. Lawrence's body jerked. His left shoulder exploded in red. The Range Rover swerved violently. Regina was screaming. Thomas was reaching for the wheel, but Lawrence pushed him away with his good arm, keeping control, refusing to stop. Lawrence! Chris heard himself shouting, "Let Thomas." Almost there, Lawrence gasped. Blood was soaking through his shirt, running down his arm. "Just need." He aimed the Range Rover directly at the security checkpoint. The vehicle smashed through the first barrier. Officers scattered, weapons raised. Lawrence hit the brakes. The Range Rover spun, came to rest sideways across the street, blocking traffic, creating an instant fortress of metal and armor. And then Lawrence collapsed. He fell against the steering wheel, his breathing harsh and wet, his left arm hanging useless. Chris didn't think. He threw open his door, ignoring Thomas's shouts, ignoring the chaos erupting around them, and pulled open Lawrence's door. Lawrence fell into his arms. "I've got you," Chris heard himself saying, his hands pressing against the wound, blood hot and slick between his fingers. "Stay with me, stay with me." Lawrence's eyes found his. Even now, even bleeding out in Chris's arms, they were calm. "Did you?" Lawrence coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Did you make it?" "You saved me," Chris whispered. His vision was blurring. When had he started crying? Again. "You saved me again." A faint smile touched Lawrence's face. "Guess I finally finished the mission," he breathed. Then his eyes closed. "No!" Chris shouted. "Lawrence! Lawrence, stay with me. Somebody help him." Thomas was there, pushing Chris aside, applying pressure to the wound. Regina was on the phone with emergency services. Police were surrounding them, weapons drawn, securing the perimeter. And Chris knelt in the street, his Tom Ford tuxedo soaked with another man's blood, watching the only person who'd ever risked everything for him slip away. Sirens approached. Red and blue lights painted the scene. Chris held Lawrence's hand. "Don't you die," he said fiercely. "Don't you dare die. Not for me. Not like this." But Lawrence didn't answer. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics swarmed. They loaded Lawrence onto a stretcher, for lines and oxygen and desperate efficiency. And as they lifted him into the ambulance, Chris finally understood. Lawrence hadn't just saved his life once. He'd been prepared to die for him. Had maybe just done exactly that. Chris Thompson had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. He'd stared down hostile takeovers, weathered market crashes, buried 3 marriages without shedding a tear. But sitting in a hospital waiting room at Mount Sinai, his tuxedo stiff with dried blood, his hands still shaking, this was different. This was waiting to learn if a good man would die because of him. Regina sat beside him, her emerald gown ruined, her makeup long gone. She hadn't left his side in 4 hours. Thomas paced like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with the FBI, NYPD, and his own team. Kayla had arrived an hour ago with fresh clothes for all of them, but no one had changed. It felt wrong somehow. Disrespectful to wash away Lawrence's blood while he was still in surgery fighting for his life. "Mr. Thompson?" Chris's head snapped up. A surgeon stood in the doorway, still in scrubs, a surgical cap dangling from one hand. Chris couldn't read his face. Couldn't breathe. "He's alive," the surgeon said, and Chris felt his lungs unlock. The bullet went through his shoulder, missed the major arteries by millimeters. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable. Incredibly lucky, considering. "Can I see him?" The words came out hoarse. "He's in recovery. Sedated. But yes, in a few hours." The surgeon left. Chris sank back into the chair, his face in his hands. Regina's hand found his shoulder. "He's going to be okay." "He took a bullet for me," Chris whispered. "A bullet meant for me. He knew what he was doing. That's what terrifies me." Chris looked up at her. He knew. He accepted it. He was willing to die, and his voice broke. "I barely knew his name, Regina. 3 weeks he drove me, and I barely knew his fucking name." She didn't answer. What could she say? Thomas appeared, his face grim. "FBI just picked up 3 suspects. The sniper, one of the chase vehicles, and..." He stopped. "And what?" Chris demanded. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Marcus Webb. Your VP of Operations." The name hit Chris like a physical blow. Marcus. 10 years with the company. Trusted. Reliable. A traitor. Webb was feeding information to Hexagon Industries, Thomas continued, his voice flat with suppressed rage. Your main competitor for the Pentagon contract. They hired a private military contractor to eliminate you. Make it look accidental. Clear the way for their bid. Chris felt sick. How much did they pay him? $2 million. Half up front. Jesus Christ. Chris stood, started pacing. How many others? Just Webb as far as we can tell. But the investigation is ongoing. Thomas moved closer, his voice dropping. Chris, I need to say something. Chris stopped. I was wrong about Lawrence, Thomas said, the words clearly costing him. I should have listened. Should have investigated deeper when he first came to me with concerns. You didn't know, Chris interrupted. I should have. That's my job. Thomas's face was lined with exhaustion and guilt. He saw what I missed. He acted when I failed. And he nearly died because I was too arrogant to believe a driver could see threats my team couldn't. Chris looked at his head of security, a man he'd trusted for 8 years, and saw the same realization he'd come to himself. They'd both been blind. We're going to do better, Chris said quietly. All of us. Lawrence woke 36 hours later. Chris was there. He'd barely left the hospital, sleeping in fits in the waiting room chair, ignoring calls from the board, the press, everyone. When Lawrence's eyes opened, confused and clouded with morphine, Chris leaned forward. Hey, Chris said softly. Welcome back. Lawrence blinked slowly, trying to focus. Did we make it? Chris felt his throat tighten. Even now, his first thought was the mission. We made it. You made it. Thanks to you. The shooter? In custody. All of them are. It's over, Lawrence. You were right about everything. Lawrence's eyes closed briefly in relief. When they opened again, they were clearer. Your inside man? Marcus Webb, VP of Operations. He's been arrested. Good. Lawrence tried to shift, winced. How long was I out? A day and a half. You lost a lot of blood. Chris paused. The doctors say you'll recover fully. 6 months of physical therapy, but full recovery. That's good. Lawrence looked at him directly. You can hire a new driver now. Someone less dramatic. Chris stared at him. Then, incredibly, he laughed. A sound that felt foreign in his throat, raw and real. I'm not hiring a new driver, Chris said. I'm promoting the one I have. Lawrence frowned. Sir? Head of Personal Security and Risk Assessment, Chris said. Full authority. You'll oversee Thomas's team, coordinate all threat assessment, have final say on my movements, my security, everything. Triple your current salary, full benefits, and... He stopped, emotion catching in his throat. And if you ever save my life again, I'm firing you. Lawrence's eyes widened. Mr. Thompson, I don't have the training for. You have exactly the training for it. Chris leaned forward. You saw what no one else saw. You acted when everyone else hesitated. You were willing to die to protect someone you'd never even had a real conversation with. That's not training, Lawrence. That's character. And character can't be taught. Thomas. Already agreed. He recommended it, actually. Chris smiled slightly. Turns out nearly getting killed together builds trust. Lawrence was quiet for a long moment, processing. Why? He finally asked. Why do this for me? Chris thought about the answer. About all the reasons he could give, strategic, practical, professional. But only one felt true. Because you restored my faith in people, Chris said simply. I'd forgotten that was possible. Lawrence's eyes shone. He nodded once, unable to speak. Chris stood. When you're ready, we have work to do. He turned to leave, but Lawrence's voice stopped him. Chris. Not Mr. Thompson. Not, sir. Chris. Thank you. Chris looked back at the man in the hospital bed, no longer his driver, no longer invisible, but someone who'd earned his respect, his trust, his gratitude in ways no one else ever had. Thank you, Chris said. For everything. The morning was unseasonably warm for October in New York. Chris Thompson stood on a temporary stage in front of a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, watching 200 faces turn toward him, veterans, mostly, with their families. Some missing limbs. Some carrying invisible wounds. All of them looking for a second chance. Beside him stood Lawrence, his left shoulder still carrying the scar from that night but otherwise fully healed. No longer the quiet driver. Now Chris's right hand in ways that transcended job titles. They'd become brothers in the 2 years since the attack. Not through blood, but through something stronger. Trust forged in fire, loyalty proven through sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chris began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "2 years ago, I almost died because I was blind. Blind to threats. Blind to loyalty. Blind to the value of people I'd trained myself not to see." He gestured to Lawrence. "This man saved my life. Not once, but twice. He did it despite being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by everyone, including me. And when I asked him why, he said something I'll never forget: 'I did what no one else would.'" Chris paused, letting that sink in. "Today, we launch the Thompson-Lawrence Initiative. This facility will train veterans and overlooked individuals in high-level security, logistics, and risk assessment. Not charity positions. Not token jobs. Real careers with real responsibility and real respect." The crowd stirred, hope visible on faces that had seen too much disappointment. Regina stepped forward, tablet in hand, ready to run operations with the same fierce efficiency she'd brought to Chris's professional life. Kayla stood nearby, already coordinating with media outlets to tell this story the right way. And Thomas stood with Lawrence's security team, no longer the sole authority but part of something larger, something better. "We're going to do something revolutionary," Chris continued. "We're going to judge people not by their credentials, but by their character. Not by their resumes, but by their resilience. Not by where they've been, but by what they're capable of becoming." He looked at Lawrence, who nodded slightly. "Because the person society overlooks might be the one standing between you and disaster," Chris said. "The quiet one in the room might be the one seeing everything. And the man you barely noticed might be willing to die for you." The applause started slowly, then built like thunder. Chris stepped back, letting Lawrence take the podium. Lawrence looked out at the crowd. His people, in many ways. Veterans who'd been cast aside. Minorities who'd been passed over. Men and women who'd proven themselves in impossible situations only to come home and find themselves invisible. "2 years ago," Lawrence said, his voice steady and strong, "I took a job as a driver. I did it to save a life, but what I found was purpose. Mr. Thompson gave me a second chance when no one else would. Now we're giving you the same thing." He smiled slightly. "Heroism doesn't always wear a badge. Loyalty doesn't announce itself. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one watching closest." Chris felt something shift in his chest. Pride, yes, but more than that. Gratitude. For this man, this partnership, this chance to be better than he'd been. They stood together as the ceremony continued, as the first class was introduced, as the future they'd built together took shape. No hierarchy between them anymore. No silence. Just two men who'd saved each other in different ways. That evening, after the crowds had left and the cameras had packed up, Chris and Lawrence stood on the warehouse roof, looking out over Brooklyn as the sun set behind Manhattan's skyline. "You know," Chris said, "the media is still questioning why I promoted you. They think there's some hidden agenda. Some strategic play they haven't figured out." Lawrence smiled. "Is there?" "Yes." Chris looked at him. "The strategy is called not being an idiot. Turns out it's revolutionary in corporate America." Lawrence laughed, a sound that had become more common in the past 2 years, as trust had dissolved the walls between them. "Your sister doing better?" Chris asked. "Much. The new treatment is working. She's back to teaching." Lawrence paused. "Thanks to the insurance you insisted on. Thanks to the salary you earned." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city light up. "You changed my life," Lawrence said quietly. "No," Chris corrected. "You saved it. Then you changed it. There's a difference." "Maybe we both did," Lawrence offered. Chris considered that. 2 years ago, he'd been a man who measured worth in profit margins and productivity, who couldn't see value in anyone who didn't serve an immediate purpose. Now he stood beside someone who'd taught him the most important lesson, that the people you overlook might be exactly the ones you need most. The overlooked man was the shield, Chris said softly, remembering. The quiet driver was the hero, Lawrence added. Loyalty doesn't announce itself. And courage often moves in silence. They'd both learned that truth the hard way. Chris turned to Lawrence, extended his hand. Not as an employer to an employee, but as an equal to an equal. A brother to a brother. Lawrence took it. Here's to never underestimating the ones who say the least, Chris said. Lawrence smiled. Because they may already be standing between you and death. They shook, the city sprawling below them, the future open ahead. Two men who'd started as strangers divided by class and circumstance, now bound by something far stronger than any contract or hierarchy could create. Trust, sacrifice, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the person you barely notice is the one who sees you most clearly. The one willing to risk everything so you can live. The one who, in saving you, shows you how to finally be the person you were meant to become. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.